one other aspect that we're seeing a lot today is a move into hardware emulation. So you have platforms that use these boards called FPGA boards, and probably the most popular one is the Mister. Do you see the PCFX having developments like that in the future? Or?
If I have anything to do with it, I hope so.
Hello and welcome to the PCFX Fan Club podcast. This is a interview episode where we're actually going to go ahead and interview someone relevant in the PCFX community today. So per usual today, I have my co-host here, Matt LaFrance.
Hello.
Hey.
Nice to be joining you.
Thanks. And so, me and Matt were on episode 0. So thank you again, guys, for watching that and your support and sharing that episode and everything. And we'll be coming back soon with episode 1 shortly. But today we really wanted to talk to somebody that we thought was a really exciting guest to have on the show. And that guest today is David Shadoff. Thanks for joining us, David.
Pleased to be here.
Cool. And so, David, you are kind of an interesting figure in the PCFX community because you actually have some direct experience with the hardware itself. So today I want to talk to you a little about, we want to talk to you a little bit about kind of, your involvement with the PCFX, sort of the projects you've been working on, but also, like with what I think we'll do with all these interview episodes, just get a general idea of, how you got to the PCFX and what led you to the system. And what excites you about this system as well. So that's going to be kind of the focus of today, I think. But I think either you or Matt would be better explaining, kind of your history and your credentials first and foremost.
I'm a developer. I've been working with the PC Engine for a long time, and recently started to take a look at the PCFX, and it's a really interesting machine as far as I'm concerned. I do have, as well as I've got a full collection of the PC Engine games, I've got a full collection of the PCFX games, which I'm sure you'll want to probe into a little bit later on in the episode. But that's it in a nutshell.
Gotcha. And so you said you recently got into like PCFX hardware. Is that like, how recently is that?
So, I've had the machine since around 97, and I tried playing some of the games back then, but the Japanese was just too opaque, and it was always I'm going to get to that one day, until this past summer or so, 2022. So,
well, cool.
I've just been ripping into it.
So Matt, you're the one who introduced me to David. I'm kind of curious, like, what do you think, when did you first learn about David, and like, what do you think is like what made David stand out to you to like bring him on the show?
We've worked in the same circles, like on and off for quite a number of years. And, we did work on a fan translation project together way back. I want to say we probably started doing that in about 2005. For Maison Ikoku. And I know I was doing some work with, I believe RPG1 at the time. And I don't know exactly. Do you think you were hanging out at romhacking.net at the time at all?
Yeah, probably that, and Zophar's Domain and a bunch of those sites. Translation was always a big thing. So many of the PC Engine and those games from that era were not really playable, and so many of the better ones were Japanese. So I was really interested in getting a couple of PC Engine translations going, and not just Maison and Koku, but we worked together on Bubblegum Crisis. Bubblegum Crash.
Yes, yep, yeah, I remember that. Yeah, so and I feel like I don't know that you've worked on a lot of projects over the years, but are there other like fan translation projects that you've worked on? Did you do some things like kind of before or after we worked on those PC Engine titles?
I did a couple of really mini hacks for, I think it was Battle Load Runner and Shanghai. Those were like single afternoon things back in 2002. And but since then, there was a big gap. But in the past year and a half, I've worked with a bunch of people on I don't know, maybe another 4 translations. Probably the biggest one was Bazaru de Gozaru.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Nice. Now, I'm curious because like I've had the files for that sitting on my computer for a really long time. I want to say, was it Esper Knight that maybe was really interested in doing? Did you work with him on that?
Not on Bazaru de Gozaru, but I
Okay.
did work with him on a couple of things, and I've got, as you must, I don't know, at least a half a dozen partial works in progress, and I'm
Yeah.
sure that at least one of them I worked with him on.
Sure.
Gotcha. I'm kind of curious. So I think you said earlier that you don't have a ton of Japanese experience, or at least not enough to play through PCFX games when you first got into the system. So what kind of led you into fan translating in general? Like, did you have a particular background that got you into like the programming side of it and hacking text in and things like that, or?
Well, it was the programming part, really. I mean,
Mhm.
it's maybe I should explain how I got into programming. As a
Yeah.
kid, I when I was about 5 years old, for Christmas I got this, 17-in-1 electronics project kit where you take these little springs and you put the wire in and you wire it up, and that was like the coolest thing in the world to me. And then you start learning a little bit more about the subject, and electronics became very expensive. So when computers came out, when home computers came out, it was still the same. I can build something, I can make it do what I want kind of idea. And I guess I was doing a paper route when I was 9 or 10, and working on trying to amass enough cash to get a computer. So I was programming before I was a teenager. Um, And of course, that sort of leads in two paths, right? And one of them is the fun path where you're digging into all sorts of stuff, but there's no money in that. You can't really make a job on that, right? The other one is corporate, and you're doing what you're asked to do, and you're making money, and it's not fun, right? So I've sort of lived those two lives for many, many years. And in the 90s, when the well, I guess it was the yeah, I guess it was the 90s when the turbo-graphx came out. It was actually the PC Engine. I first saw it in Hong Kong. I was on a vacation in the summer in '89, and I saw this machine. Now I had already written an arcade game in assembly language in the early '80s for the home computer, the color computer, and that was published, and I made like $20. It was a disaster.
Gosh.
It was right in
That's
in
awful.
the whole 1983. Games are everything. Games are crashing around us, kind of thing. So I left the whole gaming scene for half a dozen years, and I didn't even pay attention to the NES. But when I saw the PC Engine in Hong Kong, this thing was like blowing my mind. The colors, the size of the sprites, the sound, and it was around that time. Like I saw it on various different places all over Hong Kong, and one of them was playing East, which that that game just blew my mind, and I knew that I had to get one, and I had to get the whatever was going on. When it came out in the states as a turbo-graphx, I said I have to figure out how to get the Japanese games to run on this American machine. So I pulled out from my history that electronics knowledge, and I made an adapter, the Kisado adapter, which was actually quite popular for a time. People liked it. And that's sort of also brought me back into a community, because VT Garner, who ran the Turbo list at that time, he kind of reached out to me when he knew that I made the Casado, and I wasn't really even interested in the games at that point, but he reeled me back in, and I got pulled into the community there, and there's a lot of buying and selling and so on, and it was interesting. There were more and more games that I didn't even know about were coming out of Japan. So as a programmer, uh, I knew that these things were digital, especially the CDs, and there were a lot of copying aids going on in the early '90s. And you'd take a look at this binary file, and you'd say, "Well, that's great, but what is it? How can I modify it? Can I make it harder? Can I change the Japanese to English? Can I do something? I'd like to write my own game." So that was kind of driving a bunch of stuff, but mostly it didn't really go anywhere at that time. Computers were pretty weak, and the consoles were not sharing information. So that was sort of it. But then I had a vacation where I went to Japan for the first time in '97, and I just said, okay, this is amazing. I better just grab everything I can, because they had games on for like 100 yen,
Yeah.
because it
Which
was
is like
end of
less
life.
than $1, or at the time,
Exactly.
but
E-
very cheap.
exactly. So here I've got this sports bag full of games I'm coming back with, because it was maybe $700 or something, rather than $7,000, which it could have been. And that was a lot of fun. And I knew also, because the PCFX had come out in the mid '90s, and I knew that it was cool, and it was supposed to be better than the PC Engine, and it had all these improvements, but I didn't really know anything else about it, because I hadn't imported one. I hadn't imported any games. But when I visited Japan in '97, this guy George Palomara, who kind of disappeared after that, he took me around all the places in Akihabara, and he said, "You should get one of these. You should get one of those. They're gonna disappear soon." And he was right. So I got a bunch of the PCFX games. I got a bunch of stuff. Again, very good prices. I brought it back, and to be honest, for most of the PCFX stuff, I tried to play it for 5 minutes, and it was
Yeah.
opaque, and I put it on a shelf, and I said, some other time.
Yeah, lots of
And
Japanese text in front of you, and you're just like,
boy, yeah, exactly. And yeah, I didn't even know which games were playable without Japanese, because it was sort of like wall of text.
Yeah. What year was this specifically that you brought the PCFX back? Was it
'97.
97? Okay, gotcha. And like you mentioned, I think you said you knew the PCFX was out before. Did you have any thoughts that like it might come to the US at all? Was there ever a thought that like, oh, I should import this if it might get
Not
localized?
really,
Or yeah,
because the PC Engine kept coming out with better and better games, and the States was closing down the whole turbo business, and PCFX was, well, there was always this question hanging in the air, because the Saturn and the PlayStation were also both out at that time, and the PlayStation was starting to gather a lot of traction.
gotcha. So you actually get the system at that point, and at this point, have you done any fan translation work, or is that not really a thing
In
by '97 for you at least?
'97, no, what I was
Yeah.
actually into at that time was writing an emulator.
Okay.
So there were a few people who were writing emulators in the mid '90s. I was trying to get one put together for the PC Engine, and I got a reasonable way into it. But David Michel in France came out with Magic Engine, and it just blew my mind. And I said, "Okay, that's it for me." And
And he made a
Zaergrad,
PCFX emulator too, right?
he did,
Yeah, the
and I
Magic
was
Engine FX.
shocked. I was shocked that anybody could come up with enough technical info to put that together and get it working. Just amazing work.
Yeah, no, it was all very impressive, and I mean, at the time, of course, too. Like I reached out to him, and kind of uh, just through my enthusiasm, coerced him into working on a fan translation project with me. But yeah, it's cool stuff.
um so so then what led to you you know I guess at this point, did you have a full PCFX collection? Because you mentioned at the start that you had a full one. Is that something that came over time, or did you
Well, it
get it
didn't
all out
happen
right
all at
from the start?
once.
Yeah.
I don't remember all of the details, but I had a substantial collection by the turn of the century. But I think I was still picking them up here and there for a little.
Now, just because it comes up, I feel like, in our podcasts a lot. What was your opinion of the PCFX? I mean, I guess just aside from the fact that the games were, pretty text heavy and difficult to get into unless your language skills are pretty good. But what was your impression of it as a successor to the PC Engine?
So to be honest, I was confused, right? Ultimately, the things that drew me to the PC Engine were the action games, the shooters, the even the puzzle games, right? Anything that was constantly moving. I'm not the kind of person to want to read a lot of instructions, and even then, you know, Ace, it's kind of hard to call it an RPG because it's more of an action game, right?
Yeah.
Although it really bridges and it kind of gets you interested in other games that are more textual, but still, RPGs on the PC Engine weren't that text laden either, right? So you kind of had to say, well, these are very graphical, they're beautiful, there's not a whole lot of heavy text. So even if it is Japanese, I can work my way through it on the PC Engine. PCFX comes out, and they've kind of given up on action games. They've gone heavy into the dating sims. They've gone heavy into the simulations with a lot of text, and I'm like, what is this? And
Which
it's
sounds like it's a lot of like reaction from most PC Engine fans at the time was just like, oh, wait a second, I guess at least English speaking PC Engine fans, because like they were importing all these shooters and things like that, right? And then you get this thing that is just a completely like I don't think people were importing games like Galaxy Frala and Una at the time and things like that, right? Like maybe to some degree, but unless you know Japanese, it's probably just too well, actually, I don't even know how much information you would have at the time importing PC Engine games ahead of time. Now that I think about it, but
well, there were a lot of people who were importing them, and a lot of people on the Turbo list were working their way through it and writing kind of walkthroughs. So, and some of those even survive, but it's it it was kind of a slog for most people, right? The reward was the cinemas, the reward was the sound, the reward was the animations.
so I think we'll get into like your actual work on the PCFX here shortly, but I'm kind of curious about, what is so that was your relationship at the time when you got the system, right? What is your relationship today with the system? Have you played more games? Have you changed? Has your taste changed at all, or are you pretty much still in the same spot where you're like, I wish I could play more, but the barrier to entry is just too high?
Well, so one thing that's changed is I started to study Japanese about 15 years ago. So I wouldn't say that I'm quite at the level where I could, sit down and play one of the games, but I can certainly figure out the menus. I can read text with effort, right? It's at that level where, it would be a struggle to play. So it better be rewarding.
Yeah.
But some games would be like that. Certainly, if it comes up with an error message that says, "Oh, you don't have any memory," or "You've got the wrong system," or something like that, that's trivial. For me now, it wasn't trivial for me back then.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's that. The other thing was I always wanted to get into programming the system, but the tools weren't there. The 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 development boards were Japanese only and made for the Japanese computers of the day, and there wasn't a whole lot of information. But again, over the intervening years, there have been people who've done a lot of work, at least groundwork, right? So now there's a compiler that, like a GCC compiler, it's a C compiler that can target the V810. People have written libraries that target the machine, so you can actually write some PCFX stuff. And then I got, I'm not sure if you can see it, but I got one of these boards the other day.
Oh,
The
nice.
DOS,
Is that the DOS V?
that's the DOS
GA?
V one. And if you look at it up close, maybe you can't see it, but there's all these little test points and so on in there where you can kind of get some more information. So one of the things I want to do is I want to find out where emulators fall short, and I want to find out the real actual operation of the chips and then correct the behavior of the emulator so that we can actually have a better turnaround on the on development.
And
So
correct me if I'm wrong, the DOS V board is essentially, I actually have a PC98 board back here, or it's not in there, but is that the same thing where it's basically a PCFX card that you put into a Japanese PC essentially, and it'll just run PCFX games and plus some
exactly,
other stuff?
but
Okay,
DOS V uses the ISA bus that we had on our machines. The PC98 was unique to Japan,
gotcha.
and the DOS V was really just a layer of software over top of a standard IBM PC clone.
Gotcha. So that card in specific would work on potentially like US hardware, basically.
Yes, and
Okay.
I'd probably put it into a machine now if I hadn't disposed of all of them in the last 10 years.
Well, your ISO motherboards. Yeah, I mean, it's as far as I know, DOS V is really just pretty much like the MS DOS that we would have had back then. It's just it has additional character support for like Japanese characters and that kind of thing.
Gotcha. One more thing I want to ask you before we get deep into the hardware parts of the PCFX. I do like, it's interesting to talk about the DOS V stuff, and I want to hear more. But you mentioned that you had got to the point that you can actually play some PCFX games, or at least understand certain messages of them. What games have you played, and like what have you enjoyed, and what was that experience like for you?
Well, the lighter ones are things I can play. I honestly haven't played a whole lot on the PCFX, but I did play at least 5 minutes of every game to get the size of how much save game memory it uses. I've been compiling a bunch of statistics about the PCFX for development purposes and for archival. But I think, the ones that I would play are things like Zenki or what's the shooter again?
Zero Agar?
Yeah, Zero
Yeah,
Agar and Ruruli. Was that?
Udida. I don't know if I say that right, but I've gotten to the point that I'm confident enough to say it maybe wrong. I don't know. Yeah. But yeah, Udida is like the platformer, right?
Yeah.
Or it's kind of like a Metroidvania in some ways, actually, if you want to. Yeah. But I know a lot of people do not like it, but I enjoy it. So
there's a couple that I would definitely play if they were more English.
Gotcha.
Curious which games in particular.
I think it was a couple of the RPGs look just splendid, but too much text, right? So if I
Miraculum, I think is really a cool game on the system. I've played a little bit of it. Probably got, I don't remember, 6 hours into it or something like that. And Boundary Gate,
yeah.
The first
I think that came out on other systems too, right? The Boundary Gate, where Miraculum's an exclusive.
Most of the games, I understand, came out on PC98 first, right? So you can actually tell by the way that these things are accessing the disk. They're kind of like accessing it as though it was a floppy drive.
Or maybe, programmers are kind of coming, or more directly into PC development from PC98 development. Is that a
Yeah,
possibility?
I'd actually be curious, like, and this is something I should do at some point, is seeing what games came from PC 98 in the first place. I don't know if there's like I mean, obviously there's not that many games to look at, but how much of the library actually was like a port kind of thing, right? Like a Graduation 2 kind of thing, versus like Ojo Sama Susomu, which is like, um, a unique game that hasn't been ported. Like Headroom worked on it, the developer that was working on those games. But yeah, I think Graduation's a PC 98 game, right? Or is that PC Engine?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay. Anyways, that aside, did you play Welcome to Pia Carrot, by the way, the game Matt translated, or
Not yet.
yeah, well, I haven't either, so don't worry about it.
No shame either way.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, it's good to know like that you are still experimenting the system from a play style kind of thing, because it is a hard system to get into. As somebody who doesn't know much Japanese, I definitely can be sympathetic for you in that regard.
As a collector, I was a little bit curious because it seems like you definitely got into the collecting. We're visiting Japan and hauling back collections of games and stuff like that. If I remember correctly, you also, I believe, kind of helped. What was it? I forget the organization, but some people sort of archive issues of PC Engine Fan Magazine. If I'm correct in that.
Oh yes, that's right. Yeah. So I guess I got the collecting bug when I went to Japan in '97, and I picked up hordes and hordes of PC Engine games, and then I thought, well, I'm this close. Why don't I just close the gap? And the same thing with PCFX, and really, this is a long-term process, because you don't just pick up the game. A lot of these, you're like, where is it? Where is it? I got to search for it, and it's you spend more time actually acquiring them than actually playing them. And I guess it was around the mid 2000s I started thinking, man, these paper magazines are disappearing, and I need to get a collection. So I did end up getting a full set of collection, but then recently I just kind of said, this is too much. My house is full, and I need to lighten up a bit. So I was giving them away.
Really?
Well, because selling them is going to take 20 years as well, right? So
Sure.
I thought, give them to a nice home, somebody who could enjoy them. But on the way to their final destination, Gaming Alexandria is putting them through a scan process. So I think they've finished the PC Engine Fan, and they've done little bits and pieces of I think it's Gekcon PC Engine, but they've currently got all of the Gekcons, and I think 95% of the Marukatsu PC engines.
Okay. Now, so are those kind of like the main PC Engine magazines and the ones that you were collecting?
Yeah. So I kind of went a little overboard.
That can happen.
Yeah. So there was also Dengeki PC Engine, which is a much thicker but more risque version of the magazine. A little aimed at the older teenagers, we'll say.
Maybe a bit of the PCFX audience.
Yeah, and it went into the PCFX era, whereas these other ones tended to end earlier. There were a bunch of little one-off, guidebooks and so on that I also collected along the way. So that's another thing that I've got that currently I'm holding on to, especially the game-specific ones. But I'm not against scanning and translating. But it's all good. It's all a matter of how much time you have on this planet, though, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I was going to thank you very much for your efforts, because I will probably be, to an extent hitting up those scans from Gaming Alexandria, to do some research about the PCFX. And, definitely, I think that's going to help this, this podcast in particular. And, if there's anything in particular that you think, might have interesting information in it, or, would deserve to be, translated, if that's something you'd be willing to scan or to, make available, I'd be interested in that. Definitely let me know.
All right. Well, let me look in my archives and I'll get back to you.
All right. Cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that in general that has kind of come up is that like a lot of gaming preservation is not so much the video games themselves. Like there are video games that need to be preserved, right? But there's so many copies of these games, even the rare ones. There's so many copies out there, right? Most of them, and so paper material in particular, archiving that in a way that it's accessible, right? It is super important. So like that is definitely, yeah. Also thanks for me on that too, even though I can't read any of it. Like it's still super important to get that stuff scanned, and the fact that you were able to get them over to them is a huge thing. So thanks to both of you and Gaming Alexandria for that. So yeah, so you mentioned that you've been kind of poking around with the hardware, and there's a couple projects that you've talked about publicly, I think, at this point. I'm not sure if we want to start from those projects, or if you want to talk a little bit about what got you into actually working with the PCFX hardware in the first place, like what onboarded you to finally move on from PC Engine to PCFX.
Well, I wouldn't say that I've moved on from PC Engine to PCFX. I've still got one leg in both camps. So actually, it was last year. It was only last year that I started looking at the hardware for the PCFX. I mean, I'd always wanted to, and I kind of had wanted to make a little downloader card out of the FX BMP, the little backup memory thing.
Which is that, if I recall correctly, it's like a card you slide into the PCFX to like expand the storage space for save data.
That's right.
Like that, right?
And they're generally extremely expensive.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, some of the other machines have cards that are like that, and you can maybe boot from them, and you could get a little downloader into that or something for development purposes. And I saw that some people had put development information online, but it was still kind of a little bit here, a little bit there, random, and you'd have to work at drawing it all together to do something. But a couple of people from the PC Engine community, somebody who goes by the name of Elmer, but also Cheeky Bug sometimes, he was the one working on the compiler and drawing together some of the libraries to get some example code working. And a couple of people I'd never heard of before had started writing a couple of demos. One guy was Game Blah Blah, but the guy who really turned it was he was from the Virtual Boy community, a guy named Enthusi. So he came in and he made a fractal on PCFX, which when you think about it, it's not such a complex thing to write, but the fact that it was written at all on the machine was the big deal. And then
can you say what a fractal is?
Oh, it's an image with, you could take a piece and divide it into like a triangle, and then you subdivide that triangle into triangles, and then other triangles into it goes down the rabbit hole forever.
So is this just like basically a test piece of software that was running on there?
Yeah. Okay, it's like a mathematical function that people were really into in the 80s for computers. It's really a throwback kind of a thing. But what happened was he was experimenting, and he found out a couple of things about the controller, and I worked with him on getting a download mechanism through the controller.
And when you say controller, do you mean the actual controller, or I think there's like a PC term for like a controller?
The controller port.
Controller port. Okay.
Okay. So basically, I made this little board here that you plug in a USB into here, and this is actually just like the PCFX controller dongle, whatever. You,
Yeah.
you you stick it into a controller port number 2, and you can download your code in there. So that makes the whole development cycle so much faster. And then we started finding discrepancies between real hardware and Mednafen, the primary emulator. So I started making fixes on the emulator. He started making progress on the dev kit, and this all started in October or so. And from that, I was able to run some tests to get the full pinout of the backup memory port. And from that, I was able to make a little non-volatile memory backup card. This is 3D printed. So it's just been a lot of fun. Like, nobody's done any of this stuff before, and I'm not doing things that are particularly complicated, but it's just that the spark hadn't happened yet.
Well, it's really exciting to see that spark, have started and kind of ignited a lot of this activity. So, like, in terms of, for one thing, I mean, you mentioned MedDefend. So, is that the kind of some of the first like emulator development work that you've done? I guess since you were kind of working on that PC Engine emulator.
That's a good question. I mean, I had written my own emulator in the 90s, but that was when Windows was changing, and it was like a full-time job just trying to keep up with the user interface.
Sure.
When I was just trying to get the internals going, and when David Michel came out with his, I said, okay, that's it. I give up. Meanwhile, Zeograd was working on Hugo, which was not quite as good as Magic Engine, but it was open source and it would run on multiple platforms. So it was also more likely to be modifiable to have a debug interface. So again, if you wanted to develop, you need that debugger, and Magic Engine didn't have it. So we got to a certain point. He got busy, I got busy, but interestingly, through this whole period, David Michel and Zeograd and myself, we worked together on QC, which is the C compiler for the PC Engine. So a lot of stuff was happening right around the turn of the century, and then there was a gap, and Mednafen came along and filled that gap. I kind of, we'll say, gently prompted the author of Mednafen to add in some debug features, and it came along really well. So again, that's the best emulator there is for PCFX for debugging, and it's the one I've been using for PC Engine debugging for the last few years. Although I understand that there's a new one on the scene that might be useful, which is Meson.
Oh yeah. There was just like a Meson 2 or something that came out, I think.
Yeah. So that one shows promise. I haven't looked at it myself yet, but that one might even be better than Mednafen for PC Engine.
Interesting.
But there's really nothing else that emulates the PCFX.
Yeah. Yep. Now I was also curious that port, so that line on the controller port, what would that? So you're basically able to, so are you like feeding code to the PCFX that it's executing, sort of like on the fly, so to speak?
Okay, so there's two pieces to it.
Okay.
There's a boot disk,
yeah,
which basically sets up the computer to be monitoring the port, and then we send a command, which this boot disk program says, oh, I know what you want to do. You want to read some memory, so I'll send it to you. Oh, you want to write some memory, I'll write it into the memory for you. So it's a very crude processor that's loaded in from the boot disk, and then we're just doing data transport over the the controller port.
Okay, but it's very similar to what it would be doing, like fetching data off the like a CD-ROM disk.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Like yeah. What would that what would that pin on the controller port normally be used for? Is that something that's used in the during the process of controlling a game, or is that just something like separate that hasn't been used?
Well, I mean, the PCFX has what's called a serial I/O for the controllers. So each scan gives you 32 bits. Okay, and basically the PCFX has a clock, and it says up down up down up down, and the controller will send another bit each time it gets a transition. So that's exactly what this board is doing. It's sending another bit each time the PCFX asks for a bit. So 32 bits at a time, and we get about 10 kilobytes a second throughput.
And so when you're talking about these elements in particular, is this basically a way for you to just do debugging, or is it way to interface with the PCFX general, or does, you mentioned earlier you have the mouse adapter and then also the backup memory? Is that is this a part of that process and how you set those up in the first place if you were to interact with them? Or
yeah, so I mean, ultimately, in order to write for the machine, you need to understand how the machine works. So every piece of hardware that I'm building is because I've discovered something about how the machine works.
Yeah.
When the development interface through the controller port, that the primary purpose of that is to write a little test program, send to the PCFX, get it to report back some information, so we can compare against what Mednafen says and say, is it a match or is it not a match? And if it's not a match, why, and how can I fix that? So ultimately, the goal is to make the emulator a more perfect replica, as well as to speed the whole process of development cycle.
And does this open up more opportunities for like homebrewing and stuff too? Because I did see, and I think maybe it was Enthusi's video. I feel like they had a little demo running where they were able to get like some sprites, actually like sort of being controlled with the controller, walking along the screen, and maybe jumping or something like that. It was quite impressive to see. It was interesting stuff. Was that enabled by this?
I think he probably used it for testing certain things. Ultimately, up until this point, every time you wanted to run a test on real hardware, you had to burn a disk.
Sure. Yeah.
And that's not just a pain, that's also expensive, and disks are getting harder and harder to find, and you never know, are you going to wear out your CD-ROM drive and so on. So, I mean, ultimately, one of the things that I want to be able to do, but this is a long way off, is I want to be able to replace the CD-ROM part with something solid state.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah, but don't hold your breath yet.
Yeah.
we'll cross our fingers, but
yeah. But the other two things you mentioned, I believe those are complete projects, right? With the PCFX mouse and the backup memory, right?
Yeah, that's right. The mouse is working, and I mean, I could enhance the software to be able to get it to be like a generic joypad, or yeah, I guess that's it, mouse and joypad. But the backup card that's a complete project. But while doing this, I realized as well that that you could make a flash memory version of it that boots. So in other words, you could distribute a game on a cartridge, not just on disk.
So potentially, could you, like you mentioned, doing a reading from a flash drive instead of the disk drive. Is that potentially a way that can be done? Is doing that through the actual bump pack area, or is there not enough like data throughput kind of thing or something like that?
Well, you could get a game to do that,
Yeah.
but the existing games are directly addressing the CD-ROM, so you wouldn't be
Gotcha.
able to arbitrarily get games to run there.
Gotcha. So you could run like Homebrew potentially off
Absolutely,
there.
yeah.
Okay. Gotcha. So I mean, that's exciting as is, though. Honestly, like I don't know what the appetite is for like making PCFX Homebrew, but a lot of consoles do have a kind of homebrew scene alive today. Even I think like Virtual Boy even has one where people make. I think it's like a Street Fighter 2 port that made it to Virtual Boy at some point. So like that's still very exciting. Because I don't know the current homebrew scene for the PCFX very well, but being able to do it directly through the storage on the system rather than
I think the best application for that would probably be some kind of diagnostic programs. So check the controller port, check the I/O, see what kind of codes the CD-ROM is giving back. Because if you're trying to fix these machines, it only boots from the CD. So what are you going to do, right?
And I think for homebrewing in particular, if people were excited about that, probably the work being done, like speaking of the Virtual Boy with the C compiler, right, is probably as or more useful, right?
Oh yeah, no, it's so easy to program for the PCFX now, right? The C compiler is so free. Like if I compare the PC Engine and the PCFX, every constraint that exists on the PC Engine is addressed. CPU speed, the amount of memory, the whole banking business, limitations on throughput, video memory, single video controller. All of these things are addressed and easy to deal with. The C language compiler is also standard, whereas the Hue C one was never really standard. It was more C-like than actually C.
That's really exciting stuff. And like, I guess from the perspective of somebody who is kind of, is getting more familiar with the internals of the PCFX and things like that. In terms of the development that happened on the system, I feel like what ended up happening with the PCFX, and one of the reasons why I suspect that the library is a bit limited, is that developers who had a good relationship with Hudson and NEC and had done work on the PC Engine are kind of the ones that stuck with them and developed things for the PCFX. Do you think that those developers were taking advantage of what the PCFX had to offer in terms of? Because it sounds like the PCFX is kind of maybe what the super graphics would have, could have, should have been, like kind of the souped up PC Engine that kind of like gets around some of the real limitations you had with that essentially an 8-bit system, from what I understand, sort of an 8-bit processor. Do you think that people were really able to take advantage of the hardware that the PCFX offered?
Well, anytime a new console comes out, the first round of games is not really taking advantage of that. And
Sure.
And people are learning, okay, how do I take advantage of the new hardware? How do I make the best use of the stuff? And the tools get better. But I think the PCFX kind of didn't get that opportunity because the first round of games was pretty much the end of the line. Maybe you could say some developers came out with a second round, but it's not like people were continuously honing their skills. If they had stuck around longer, probably. But I think, I was thinking about this today, and I think the 2D aspect, it does fantastically. but it's like the game changed, and a lot of focus from users was on 3D, even in its crude form that it was, which is sad. I think I think also that a number of the action games that I liked, and I think Matt, you were saying that you also liked, they just weren't there on the PCFX. It's as though Hudson was said, no Bomberman.
Mm-hmm. I mean, even things that people, it seems like, Japanese gamers were clamoring for, like another Tengai Makyo RPG and things like that. It seems like it was in the works for the PCFX, but for some reason wasn't, development wasn't started for it to come out in the first year or two, and it never materialized. There's some lingering questions about that. Definitely some mysteries.
Yeah, I was trying to while we were going over this, I was trying to think of like developers who would have had like a second round of games on the system, and you might be able to see kind of more of that advancement in the use of the hardware. And Unix is obviously one of the easiest answers because they developed for the system all the way through the entire platform's life, right? But then you also have like Ruby Party, who made those Angelique games, right? The Otome games, and I can't remember for sure, but Matt, I think it's all of them or most of them launched on the PCFX first and foremost, and then they moved to other platforms afterwards, right? So
I mean, I wouldn't take that as the absolute truth. That is kind of my impression, though. I mean, I know that there was one on the Super Famicom, and I don't know if like it came out on the Super Famicom first, and then they released the PCFX one. But it does seem like the PCFX was sort of the initial go-to platform for the Angelique series before it ended up on other systems. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I'll have to look to see if there's other developers, but those would be the two developers I can think of that you might be able to see in their later games, how their use of the system had evolved and things like that, through games like First Kiss Story and I'm trying to think of the later stuff. Blue Breaker was pretty later, I think, as well. But yeah, so
Tenku Angelique Tenku no Requiem or something.
yeah. So in working with the PCFX hardware, I'm not sure. Have you worked on any other contemporary systems around that time outside of PC Engine, or has it been pretty much PC Engine and PCFX for you?
Just PC Engine and PCFX. I mean,
Gotcha.
I did some work with computers before that, as I said, in the early '80s, but I didn't spread it around too much.
Gotcha. So your focus on making the mouse adapter and the memory pack first and foremost, it sounds like probably a lot of that came out of kind of just the initial testing phase and what was the easiest to create, right? Because I think you made the mouse adapter first, right? And I guess the question would be is like, what led you to making a mouse adapter first and foremost? Because it's not exactly like a function of the system a lot of people think a lot about, right? Like there's maybe around 8 games that support it, and it's more or less just like a replacement for the mouse. Like what drove you to do that specifically over other aspects of the system, like the storage for the
Yeah,
packaging
so
later?
a couple of things, right? One of them is, have you seen how much they go for?
I got mine for free on accident, but yeah. But yes, they're expensive.
Yeah, they're expensive, and they're 1990s mice with the cable and the ball and the gathering of the dust and so on. Just miserable things, really. So, and I had made a similar one for the PC Engine as well. I had just come off of making the mouse for that, and I thought, oh, it would be kind of cool to do the same thing for the FX.
Were there any similarities between working with the PC Engine mouse versus the PCFX mouse, or was it pretty much two separate projects?
Well, so on that, I use a microcontroller board. So it's the Raspberry Pi Pico, but Adafruit has a smaller version that's a little more compact, and so the USB part was completely identical, right? I use the USB part to read the mouse, and the encoding from that to go to the system was different, but not that substantially different. PCFX was actually easier in the long run.
So we talked a lot about emulators today, with software emulators with Mednafen and even Magic Engine FX a little bit. But one other aspect that we're seeing a lot today is a move into hardware emulation. So you have platforms that use these boards called FPGA boards, and probably the most popular one is the Mister, which is like a project where you kind of build this little device yourself, but it can do like actual emulation of the hardware and like change kind of the board configuration, to my understanding, to kind of better suit that hardware. So do you see the PCFX having developments like that in the future, or?
If I have anything to do with it, I hope so. That's actually one of the reasons why I'm trying to probe into the hardware so much, is and learn more about it, is so that we can get something like that. I think it's realistic to think that it could fit on the Mister. We've got a PlayStation emulator going on there, and I think it's a little bit more complex. Now, in terms of my capabilities on of creating a core, I think it's outside of my reach, but I could probably get it maybe 30% of the way there. So, and certainly I've been doing a lot of maintenance on the PC Engine core. So that's I find it to be a lot of fun, but some of this stuff is pretty complex and very hardware specific. So I'm learning a lot.
When it comes to the getting Mister compatibility up and running, like what do you view as the key benefits? Is it mostly an accessibility thing and like the fact that hardware's dying, or are there other things like as a developer that a Mister core kind of helps you with?
Um, I don't think it's really helping developers specifically, but I think it's a little bit easier to precisely replicate the behavior. That doesn't mean that all of the cores are replicating the behavior, but the ones that are insisting to to get it as close as possible are doing a much better job than their software counterparts for a number of reasons. One of them is enthusiasm, but because you get to deal with a minimum quantum of a cycle, like a 10 nanoseconds, as opposed to on a computer, you're saying, well, I'm going to do like 3/4 of a scan line, and I know that 15 things are going to happen, and I'll just make them happen in the sequence I think they should happen, as opposed to this is how it's actually happening on the machine. You might think that there's not a big difference, and there really isn't for most games, but there's always that edge case.
When the project you talked about today with the mouse and the additional storage and things like that, do any of those projects help a project like making a Mister core at all? Like your findings through that, does that help people understand, or is that kind of a completely different process?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's kind of hardware, it's kind of software, but I don't think it's really in the same direction as Mister. But it's fun.
Yeah. The most important part of that is that you enjoy it. So, and it gives back to the community and things like that too. So yeah, I mean, we've talked about the mouse adapter today and the bump pack. I keep blanking on the name, like storage thing that you put in the system.
Uh,
Um,
I think you were calling yours specifically the what is it, the
And
NVBMP for non.
NVBMP, yeah, the
Yeah.
non-volatile BMP, because
gotcha.
the original one needs batteries, and you probably if you buy one, you probably get corrosion from somebody who left in the batteries too long. And
Yeah.
I did want to ask actually specifically about that. So, I mean, because you saw that in some old cartridge games and things like that too, and I assume that volatile memory was probably cheaper, but were there even like non-volatile memory solutions back then that could have been used if somebody wanted to spend a lot of money or something, or is that more of a recent thing?
so in the 80s and 90s, the normal way of writing something was EEPROM. and EPROMs needed special voltages to actually program them. So you wouldn't be able to do that in circuit on a regular console.
Okay, you couldn't just do like a 5 volt or something. Okay.
Right, and most of these, when you're talking about the battery backed, they used SRAM plus a battery, and the SRAM was really expensive, right? So they didn't want to do that, but they had to do that. So Flash was just starting to come out in very small quantities at very expensive prices, around 99-ish,
hmm
and it didn't really become viable for consoles until mid 2000s, 2005 to 2007, for home use and so on. So I think a lot of times people say, well, why didn't they just do this at that time? And it's like saying, well, gee, why didn't they just drive to the market in the 1700s?
Yeah.
So
Why didn't they just invent this thing earlier?
yeah, exactly. But it's really all about cost, right? The PC Engine had very limited memory because of cost. The PCFX had tons more because it was cheaper. And non-volatile memory, it's very common now, and um the stuff that I'm using in the NVBMP is MRAM, but you could also use FRAM. MRAM is magneto-resistive memory, and FRAM is ferroelectric. Ultimately, these two things, they act the same as SRAM, and they're just as fast. So your circuit isn't going to know any better, but they don't lose their charge. And these are not necessarily cheap, but they're not particularly expensive either.
And probably more reliable than the actual original backup memory reducing
Yeah,
batteries.
they actually are. I think that the specs on one of the types was it can be rewritten 10 to the 14th times, which is equivalent to once per second for 100 years or something like that.
Okay, so if your PCFX still works in 100 years, then maybe.
Yeah.
um, so yeah, so like actually, because I'm glad you like mentioned that, because like in my mind, my brain was just like, there's probably just like an SD card slot on it, right? But like the actual data that's on these, it sounds like there's, and maybe you can go into a bit more detail as we get into like how you actually built these things if you want to. But the flash storage on there is like something that's actually on the board, right? And so can this interface with like a PC at all without like a specialized connector? Is there like a USB port on it or something like that? Or is it pretty much only exclusively made to be plugged into a PCFX?
This version is made only to be plugged into a PCFX. I was thinking at some point in the future to add, uh, something like a USB port onto it, but haven't got there yet.
Gotcha. And is that something that it requires like more knowledge of the PCFX itself, or is that more of just building the right board for that kind of thing?
It's building the right board. Basically, you'd need to have an interface circuit and turn off like be able to disconnect it electrically from the PCFX.
Gotcha. So yeah, so like if somebody was interested in getting these, I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we're at the point where it's just like, oh, there's a storefront you can go on and just buy these off there, right? This is something that you're going to have to go through a bit more of a process where you are either going to have to make it yourself or go through somebody to make it, right?
Right. Yeah. I'm in Canada, and there's like it's not viable to make these things commercially, but I do publish the designs. They're all on my GitHub. It's github.com/dshadoff, which is DSHADOFF, and one of the repositories for the NVBMP is PC-FX-NVBMP, and then the mouse controller is in another repository called PC_engine_. RP2040_projects, and I just realized that that's really long and not
We'll
very
have links
descriptive.
if they're available
Right.
in the podcast description. If somebody really wants to pull them up, we'll put them
Sure, but I'm thinking to myself, one of these days I'm going to take my PCFX work and I'm going to create like a GitHub organization. I'm going to move all of that data into there so it can be like uh, um, a one-stop shop for PCFX stuff. We get other people to donate their work in there as well.
That would be really exciting.
Yeah. So I'd imagine most people who have the capability to put this stuff together could probably work with like just that kind of thing. But say someone like me who has no idea how to do that stuff, like what would be your recommended route for something like that? And suggestion of like how I would get like a backup or get these devices.
So what I do try to make it as easy as possible for somebody, but it does take a little bit of effort. So there's a bunch of files inside the repository that you can submit to a board manufacturer, and it's almost that simple. For example, I get these built at a company called JLC PCB, and there's 3 sets of files that you need. One of them is the Gerbers, which is just the name that they use for the definition of the board itself. Then the assembly is you've got some information for the pick and place machine and the parts list. All of those files are in there. The BOM is the bill of materials of the parts list, and assembly is the pick and place machine information. And you just submit those files to JLC PCB, and if they've got the parts on hand, they'll just you can make a couple of boards like that, and they'll send them off to you. The case is also in there as a 3D print, and I ordered resin ones from there as well. So it's not like I've got a soldering iron. I'm doing this stuff in my basement 100 times. I generally order a few at a time, and they make nice Christmas presents.
But that's pretty amazing. Like, I mean, I feel like that's sort of a modern thing where, these PCB manufacturers, there's a lot of sort of automated, you can do one-off boards and things like that. So, basically, like you said, as long as they have the parts, you can essentially order this stuff directly from a PCB manufacturer, including the case, it sounds like.
Yeah, the parts has really been the hard part for the last 3 years or so, and
Yeah.
I can see that things are there's a light at the end of the tunnel. It's not quite here yet for all parts, but it's coming.
Well, I wanted to thank you. I don't know if you mind me sharing, but you did, send me one of your units here, and it's super cool. I tried this out. I mean, it basically does exactly what it's meant to do. The case also, I was really impressed. Like it's a really nice fit. That's one of the things I was curious about. Like I put it in, and it's like it fits in really nicely, comes out really nicely, and the PCFX recognizes it just like a normal memory card. So no troubles. It seems like a really great design.
The case was designed by Jeff Chen on that I know from Twitter. So
nice.
He did a fantastic job.
Yeah, it's cool. Yeah, it even has like nice logo branding. It's pretty neat. Pretty spiffy.
Kind of hard to see, but I know the contrast is.
And so the mouse itself doesn't have a case or anything like that. That is just a board that you plug into the controller port, and then you plug a USB cable in, right?
That's right. It's one of these days. One of these days.
Yeah, I feel a little bad. I feel like we didn't talk about the mouse that much, but also like from what I've used of the mouse, I'm not. It's the implementation's always kind of iffy with most games. I feel like at some point I would like to sit down and like go through all those games and do like a write up of like, hey, this is how it handles it. I did use it for Farland Story FX though, because it helped make the cursor movement a lot faster.
Oh yeah,
for a very sluggish video game, I feel like, so it helped a little bit with that too.
One of the things I learned, and this is just a little interesting piece of trivia, One of the things I learned while making the mouse adapter is that the PCFX defined but did not ever sell a a, a, a multi-tap.
Oh,
And
and the
I
PC
want to.
Engine had at least a couple, right? Like, or an official one.
That's right. Yeah. The PC Engine was their original design was to have 5 different ports, right? But through the multi-tap. The PCFX apparently had the design to accept 4 ports per connector.
Okay.
So you'll notice that there's a baseball game for, I think it's Power League FX.
Yeah.
It allows 8 players, and that's a kind of an odd number, isn't it? I'm pretty sure that if I built multi-tap for the FX, that it might allow multiple players to play on multiple controllers. But I have to investigate that. That's another 2023 project.
To be a hit at any game convention you go to. Come over here and play PCFX
Eight
Power League
player Power League, that would
baseball.
be
I'm sure
fantastic.
everyone will be excited and be like, "What is this thing you're even showing me? Don't worry about it. Just play it." So, and I think one more question I want to ask about these is, so I see in some cases, and pardon me, I'm very ignorant of a lot of this stuff. So if it's like this is not, I don't know what the whole deal is, but I believe with a lot of things like HDMI adapters and things like that for various consoles, somebody who develops that design will like make it open source. And so you do see some companies that are, larger, and obviously the PCFX doesn't have like an actual audience, but you'll see some companies who are dedicated to that kind of thing build and sell those devices. Is that possible with the designs you have, or is the use of it limited to only like personal use kind of thing?
Yeah, so I put all of my stuff up so far under the MIT license, which means you can take it, you can modify it, I mean, please, if you have an improvement, put it back into the repository. You can use it for commercial purposes. No restrictions. Just I'm not liable if you make a mistake. But I mean, ultimately for the PCFX, especially, it's such a tiny market. We all have to help each other, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I figured, it's probably small enough that it probably wouldn't be a thing, but I thought it'd be at least worth mentioning the possibility, right? That it is a possibility that something like that could come down the line.
Yeah, that's. I
So
mean, if somebody wants to turn this into a commercial product, I'm not going to stand in their way, and I'm not going to give them hell or anything. I would like to see it. I don't. My commercial part of my head is thinking, I don't think there's a whole lot of money in that.
I don't either.
So so I wish you luck. But
Maybe when this podcast is done,
right. One little thing I've been kicking around in the back of my head is if folks were interested in, like, let's say, plastic bag, protectors or something for PCFX games and things like that. That's something I've had manufactured in the past. We could do like a little Kickstarter or something like that, but I don't know. I don't know if I'm that ambitious. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I have any experience in that realm either. So we'll see. But yeah,
who knows?
Yeah. So before we wrap up, David, I know you mentioned the possibility of replacing the CD drive on the system and everything, but like, what are kind of the general hopes you have in the future for the system? Is there anything that we haven't talked about today that you're like, I would love to see this for the PCFX, whether it be from you or somebody else?
Well, I mean, just in general, I'm hoping to make emulation more accurate. I'm hoping to get a Mister core at some point for PCFX, and I'm going to need help on that. But or rather, I will help somebody else because it's this is still above my level. The development kit for Homebrew is well on its way. So I think it's not long until we start seeing some Homebrew. It might not be games at first. It might be like diagnostics and things like that. Maybe Artemio's 240p suite might come out.
Oh yeah.
right?
Somebody will have bad apple or something running on it. Is that what it's called?
the Toho song or whatever?
I guess it's Doom and Bad Apple, right?
Yeah.
But that and an optical drive emulator, all of those things would be at the top of my list.
One other question. You have that DOS board, like the PC98 card. This does have additional capabilities to do some additional like 3D related things. It's this game called like Same Game, and there's also like a 3D fighter test. Do you see any developments for that in the future? Because I think right now that is not an emulatable thing. I think you have to do it with real hardware to play that software at this point. If I could be wrong about that, but
yeah, well, there's like one game written for it, right? Or sorry, one game and a few demos,
and like Dojin fan game kind of things as well.
Yeah, but I think there's still not enough known about it to like. Yeah, I guess eventually, once the dev kit is I would rather focus the efforts on the dev kit to get some 2D stuff up and running. I would maybe be interested in doing something on the 3D, but only if it was already specified. That's the real difficult part is emulator authors probably get a lot of credit, but the people who need the credit, the people who deserve the credit, are the people who actually discover the behavior of the system and the edge cases and the tests that differentiate between working and not working. Those are the people who are the real heroes, I think. And you probably never hear anybody's name.
Yeah. Yep. But you can't write the emulators without that.
Exactly. So, I mean, that's I might be the biggest name of people you've never heard behind the scenes in emulations.
Yeah, I find unfortunately a lot of this kind of stuff is kind of thankless at times, right? It feels like a lot of names get buried and things like that. So it is a shame.
It's not why I do it. Thank goodness.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's why we really wanted you, on this, this podcast, to, get the word out a little bit. Let us know what you've been up to.
Yeah, like super appreciate your insight on everything as well. Like I don't know if anybody, like how many other people are actively looking at the PCFX hardware like in the modern day. So I imagine you're a part of a handful of people at most, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it's 3 developers and 1.5 translators.
Yeah. So, and I guess one thing is like, sorry, I know we're trying to wrap up here, but like, does the thing you're doing potentially lead to more possible fan translations, anything like that in the future?
I would love it to. Yeah, I think it's very likely, and of course, making sure that emulation is accurate is a key part of that, right?
Gotcha. All right. Well, we're going to wrap up today's show with that. Thank you so much for coming today, David. David, did you want to point people to any social platforms, or are there any things you want to kind of make people aware of?
I guess people can find me on Twitter. My handle is at SHADOFF_D. That's Shadoff D. And on GitHub, I'm D Shadoff. Just to mix things up a bit, I put the D at the beginning on that one. But really, I tried mostly to keep to PC Engine and PCFX gaming type things on those platforms.
Gotcha. Cool. And yeah, we'll have links to both your Twitter and the GitHub and all the links you mentioned earlier as well in the description if anybody wants to check that out for that. So again, thank you so much for coming on the show today. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. And so, yeah, for the PCFX fan club, thanks for tuning in. I know this is before our official episode 1 per se. So it's kind of an interesting time, but you guys came out and supported us for episode 0. So we really appreciate that. We are, open to hearing about, what you're doing in the PCFX community, even if it's not something that you view as important. We'd be happy to hear from you. We're definitely kind of perusing around, trying to get interviews and things like that. So if you think you're working on something cool and important, let us know, or maybe not important if you think so, but we still would like to hear about it if you want. But yeah, you can email us at Rolfie at PCFXfanclub.com, and we will go ahead and receive an email there. You can also reach out to us on Twitter, and also we have a Discord group as well. Links for those will also be in the description too, so feel free to join any of those. The Discord group has been really fun. A lot of nice PCFX conversations in there. But yeah, but we'll be back probably within the next month or so with episode 1. So please look forward to that. Then otherwise, though, thank you guys again so much for listening, and I hope you guys have a great month. Talk to you later. Bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.